Geoverse Part 1 To Friend is Human by Geodesic Dragon Chapter 8 United Part 2 I kicked open the bedroom door as hard as I could, carrying Twilight in my arms. As I placed her down on the bed, she bit her lip, the lust in her eyes clearly visible. "You know that I love you, right?" I asked. Twilight nodded. "And that I wouldn't want to pressure you into doing something you don't want to do?" Twilight raised an eyebrow. "Are you going somewhere with this?" she asked. I sighed and looked her in the eye. "Are you absolutely sure you want this?" I asked. "Like 100% crystal clear?" Twilight reached up and kissed me, her tongue darting inside my mouth as she did so. "Does that answer your question?" she replied as she broke away. "I want this, I'm sure of it." I smiled warmly. "I'm glad to hear it," I said. "But you do remember that I'm—" Twilight raised an eyebrow as I trailed off. "A virgin?" she offered. I nodded and blushed. "Don't worry about that," she said soothingly. "I am as well, and there's no pony else I'd rather lose it to than you." "Likewise," I replied. "So where do we begin?" Twilight laid herself flat against the bed. She turned to look at me and smiled before nodding her head at her back. "How about a massage?" she asked sultrily. "I bet you can do all sorts of wonderful things with those." She bit her lip and took a sharp intake of breath. "Fingers of yours." I grinned and got onto the bed, straddling Twilight's back. I cracked my knuckles and got to work, running my hands down both sides of her body. A soft moan told me I was doing something right, so I began rubbing my fingers into her fur. The tiny voice beneath me said. "That feels nice." "I'm glad you think so," I replied, "because there's plenty more where that came from." I punctuated this by moving my hands further down, near to Twilight's cutie mark, and continuing the same rubbing motion I had been doing beforehand. Twilight's moans increased in volume, which caused me to experience a very pleasant pressing motion in my trousers. "Keep making those noises," I said in the sweetest tone I could muster, "and this night will be over before it even begins." Twilight flipped over onto her back. "Well, we can't have that," she replied. "Lie down and I'll see what I can do to alleviate your discomfort." I did as I was asked and lay on my back. With a flourish, Twilight magicked my trousers and underwear onto the floor, exposing my stiff cock, which she eyed hungrily. "I don't see any reason why we both can't enjoy this," she said as she climbed onto my chest and turned away from me. I realized what she was getting at and lifted her tail, exposing her slightly moist pussy. A warm feeling on my cock took me by surprise as Twilight took me into her mouth. I groaned in pleasure as her tongue flicked back and forth across the head. Deciding to repay the favor, I ran my tongue slowly and gently across her slit. Despite having a mouthful of dick, Twilight moaned in pleasure before taking in my entire length. Fighting back the urge to come there and then, I began probing her with my tongue when I saw her clit. Without a care in the world, I began sucking on it. I felt Twilight's lip clamp around my cock as she began sucking for all she was worth. Neither of us stopped as we continued, each of us keen to make the other come first. Eventually, Twilight sat up, my cock leaving her mouth with an audible pop. She turned around so that she was facing me and positioned herself over my member. "That's enough of that," she said. "Let's move on to the next stage, shall we?" I nodded feverishly as Twilight painstakingly lowered herself onto me. The feeling of penetrating her was incredible. It was though my cock was wearing a silk-lined satin glove. Twilight sat still for a moment to allow herself to adjust to my being inside her, and then she slowly started bouncing, being careful to keep as much of me inside of her as she could. Not wanting to feel idle, I grabbed hold of her flanks with one hand and began thrusting. I took myself out slowly before driving my cock back in with force. The squeals of pleasure coming from the unicorn's lips were all I needed to keep going. "Oh, dear Celestia, that feels good!" Twilight panted. "You'd better not write to her about this," I said between thrusts. Despite being a virgin, Twilight didn't seem to be experiencing any pain or discomfort from the vigorous fucking. I assumed that either ponies didn't have hymens, or Twilight had been up to no good with various rubber appendages. The latter thought dominated my mind as I imagined her using a dildo on herself. Needless to say, my pace quickened, as did the volume of our collective squeals and grunts. I stopped pumping her for a moment and pulled out before sitting upright on the bed so that I was looking into her eyes. Twilight looked at me with a puzzled expression on her face. I gave her a passionate kiss before I laid her down on her back and proceeded to position myself over her. "It's your turn to lie down now," I said, "so you just relax and let me do all the work." Twilight gave me a nod, followed by a contented sigh as I entered her again. The benefits of this position were twofold. First, it allowed for deeper penetration, which pleased us both immensely. Secondly, it allowed us to kiss, a lot. This itself allowed us to mask the sounds of our lovemaking as we moaned into each other's mouths. The feelings I was experiencing were nothing short of pure bliss and ecstasy. I never wanted this night to end. Unfortunately, my cock had other ideas, and soon I was on the edge of exploding. "Ugh, Twilight," I moaned. "I think I'm gonna come." Me too," she squealed. Keep going." I increased my speed, and soon neither of us cared how much noise we were making or who heard it. With a final primal cry, I emptied myself into Twilight's pussy, filling her with as much cum as I could muster. At the same time, I felt Twilight's juices flowing down my cock and onto the sheets, creating a sticky mess beneath us. Panting, I pulled out and lay next to Twilight on the bed. The grin on her face was the best thing I'd seen all day. "I think I could have done better," I said. Twilight kissed me on the lips and smiled. "For your first time," she said, "you were great. I hope there's more of this in the future." I returned her smile with one of my own and wrapped my arms around her. The smell of sweat and sex hung in the air, and I felt a strong sense of accomplishment. For here I was, in a new world, for a fresh start at life, with a mare I loved, united at last.